combined arms, military operations. So that's that's the obviously the example is Ukraine. I'll just introduce give background before I introduce Chris Holden from Recorded Future, is to say that Recorded Future and CRDF Global met through a very interesting initiative called the Cyber Defense Assistance Collaborative that was started very shortly after the invasion in Ukraine, the invasion of February last year. At the urging of some former CISOs who people affiliated with the Aspen Cybersecurity Group, CEOs of places like Recorded Future, Palo Alto Networks, Microsoft, Splunk. There's a number of Mandiant, a number of well-known, highly regarded, cutting-edge cyber companies, and not all of them actually want to be known. Some of them have contributed time and effort and just are doing it quietly, who came together to provide personnel, tools, processes, training on behalf of Ukrainian organizations. And Recorded Future is a great example. A ton of effort in that. And CDAC, by the time I learned about this, because CRDF Global been in Ukraine we've been in Ukraine since 1997, but we were doing cybersecurity since about 2019, 18-19. But it was a kind of the cyber hygiene curriculum development. Joel from Purdue can talk about some of the stuff that we were doing. Good stuff, but not the threat intelligence, endpoint security, attack surface management, the kinds of things that they absolutely needed across multiple boards. We learned about this. That was really cool. They're doing some high-end stuff with some really good technical skills. And Greg Ratke, who founded the organization, got it going, told me that he was probably going to have to create a nonprofit organization so he could get some funding, some donors who wanted to give money. And I said, well, we're a nonprofit organization and we're doing cybersecurity stuff. So CDAC is now has been since July of last year, a CRDF global initiative. It comes under our nonprofit. We're working very collaboratively with CDAC. But when I talk about heritage CDAC, cyber defense assistance, I'm talking about kind of specialized capabilities, still a broad spectrum, but that are particular needed to a country that is separated from a concerted state actor-driven series of efforts to undermine and attack critical infrastructure, morale, information, telecommunications. So our panel, as I mentioned, Chris Holden from Recorded Future, Chief Client Officer, Intelligence Services. Joel Rossman, who you're getting a second bite at the apple of. Joel is the Managing Director of Purdue's Sirius, and as I mentioned, was a great help to some of our pre-existing State Department funded work in Ukraine and the Balkans. And very pleased to have Kirill Gonchevuk, who is the Chief Strategy Project Officer for Ukraine Telecom, formerly CISO, has appeared at the Cyber Future Foundation in the past and has some really insightful, in some ways chilling, to share with us today. So thanks very much. If you don't mind, Chris, if you would just say a few words about some of how, what I've missed in describing how Recorded Future and you've been involved in supporting Ukraine.
Sure. Is this something? Thank you so much for having myself and the group of us here. I'll fill in a little bit more detail and make sure that we have some time for the introductions here and conversation. So my role overseeing all of the client deployments that we have at Recorded Future, which is an intelligence company, principally in cyber threat, but also in kinetic and supply chain and disinformation, all sort of the flavors of threat that you might want to consider in the face of conflict, whether it be digital, whether it be physical, whether it be information-based. So my responsibility at the company is to deliver the resources that our clients need to put intelligence to work for our technology in particular, but more broadly around training, around process development, around services, and integrating data into technologies that you might already run as part of your security ecosystem. And we work with about 2,000 organizations globally today. I have staff that's based all around the world. We work with about 20 or so Ukrainian entities at the moment, some of those in the public sector, a few of those in the private sector. Much of that work with the Ukrainians has developed as part of the CDAC initiative, which is effectively providing services and resources and technology as part of the effort in defending against the invasion. And that has largely unfolded over the past, call it 12 months or so, in rapid succession, where we have started to deliver technology and services to a variety of organizations in the country. So we have personnel who are based, we have a few people in my team who are based in Ukraine to help liaise, but a lot of this work is being done virtually and digitally as best as we can from afar. And we're grateful for the opportunity to do that. And we take a lot of pride, but realize that we are largely from afar in supporting this effort. So that's sort of my context for participating in this.
Do you have an idea of the estimated value of the tools and time and services that Recorded Future has donated over the last 18 months?
I don't know if I have a hard number that I would put out, but we have one dedicated, we have an FTE who's based in Kiev, who's responsible as the principal liaison to the organizations we work with. She is wholly dedicated to this work. And it's probably somewhere in the order of $20-25 million of software.
Yeah.
So,
and I think that's and Recorded Future is one of the most active, but it's I think CRDF Global, we've invested just to help kind of underwrite the admin of this, probably $400,000, $500,000. But what we say is, like, it's leveraging $50 million worth of and that's great. It's, however, and this, I hope we get into this a little bit later, is when you're thinking of it from a policy perspective and capability of the nation, at forging partnership, that fifth pillar, how do we help countries? This is not a sustainable model. You can't expect that for the Philippines or Taiwan or Vietnam, someplace in Latin America, that all of a sudden these privately held companies, publicly held companies, are going to suddenly donate a bunch of stuff. And so the USG, I know, is struggling with some of the challenges of how do you create a framework that takes advantage of the private sector capabilities, but is done in such a way that is more consistent with traditional counter-proliferation, counter-terrorism, development assistance. Joel, would you mind sharing a little bit about your involvement with the Ukrainian and any further on your Purdue, the Purdue series?
Sure. I'm honored to be on two panels because they told me I was going to get paid twice as much, so I'm really 5 years ago, I had no clue that I'd do any work in or with or for Ukraine. And CRDF Global had called and said, we know that Purdue is a very strong university in cybersecurity, and we have some funding, and we could really use some help in running a curriculum development for some Ukrainian universities. Like, yeah, it's right up our alley, no problem. And I won't talk tons about that work, but there was significant amount over the next 3 years working with 11 different Ukrainian universities. I'm extremely proud today to say that there are 13 different courses being taught in Ukrainian universities that were co-developed. But from our existing relationship, the phone call came in and said, hey, we're getting charged, CRDF getting charged with trying to develop some programs, not just in capacitance building or curriculum development, but also in strengthening critical infrastructure from the cybersecurity perspective in Ukraine. Is that something that you could help us with? And kind of smiled and said, okay, well, DHS charged us to write the curriculum for ICS security. We're the technical university for the Department of Energy's cybersecurity for advanced manufacturing, and through the Department of Energy, since the DHS established Purdue as the one university to do threat modeling. I said, I think we can help. And pandemic hit and everything went to hell. And what was supposed to be grand going to Ukraine for my second and third trip ended up being remote. But we developed 4 different training sessions that were weekends long. So everybody in Ukraine had their 9-to-5 job during the week as well. So weekends were given up in training, hands-on training, and then at the end of it, they were all very based on 4 particular areas of cybersecurity. And it was extremely rewarding project. The feedback we received from the participants in Ukraine, the participants felt that they'd actually learned some new techniques, some new technologies, some processes that they thought could help. Little did we know then that the war was right around the corner. And my marketing communications department at Purdue heard about that when they wrote a great big huge article on how Purdue saved Ukraine. I thought they way overstated everything we did, but I do take a very high personal pride in being a very, very small contributor to helping Ukraine fight off the Russian invasion at that time.
Thank you, Joel. And Carol, before you go, Val, for all of you who are complaining about how hard it was to get to Ottawa, Carol had to drive 12 hours to get to the airport. So thank you for being here. And could you kind of give us a little picture of the early days when you were trying to finish some crisis in the middle of an outright war?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for everything that you delivered to Ukraine and to help us to fight on independence and for the whole democratic world, which we are now in the frontiers, and only due to the support which we get, we are still there. Yeah, for sure. In the very beginning of the war, it was nightmare because you, as I said, no one, and any of disaster response or disaster response plan won't work in the country. Everybody thinks when they develop such a plan, but in the one moment overnight, everybody in the same situation, and you are not reliant on your partners, you are not reliant on your staff, because it's a physical attack on Kyiv, on whole country, and they are focused on their physical safety, on safety of their families. And at the same time, you have cyber incidents, you have missiles attacks, you have a blackout, or any other situation, and you need to in this field how to respond and how to encourage your team stay on the duty and continue to fight. And this is was the biggest challenge for the first months of the war. So for us, it's changing of understanding what is going on.
There was an article in April, 2 months after the invasion. I remember it's such an obvious thing, but it kind of hit me in a land invasion where territory is being taken. You have to think about the compromise of access to your system. And there was a telecom employee that was, give us your password. And that's how the access. So there was no need to hack in. When you've got a kinetic operation going on, you can do cyber things by blunt force and intimidation in ways that don't require a lot of sophistication. And I think that was something that you, Carol, you would, if you had any advice for someone, a counterpart who was in a country facing the potential, what would you have done differently if you could have in the year or 12 or 18 months prior to February 2022,
if you had known what was happening, if you could, and what would you advise?
The one biggest advice, as it's all vulnerabilities or all hidden which we know in our infrastructure, they was realized in the first 2 months through the invasion. So we was in the middle of transformation, and as a huge enterprise, transformation took a month or years sometimes. And we know that we have some vulnerabilities, some out-of-date equipment, and but due to the old procedures, and we all working in enterprise, we know how it can take. But still, in the first few months, everything that we know was realized. So situation when you are in a crisis, you should be prepared, and you should push your effort to be your problems as soon as possible, because in the end of the day, they will be used in the most worst scenario which you can realize.
Chris, what would you, from your perspective, from the threat intelligence and other areas that you've kind of focused on with clients, what would you say is often missed or under-resourced in the left of the boom scenario?
Yeah, before I answer directly, I think one of the interesting things that will be probably reflected upon from a cyber defense assistance or response scenario as we look back on what we've seen over the last almost 2 years, and probably includes a big part in training and preparation and readiness. And I think it's not to jump ahead and to not answer your question, I will directly. But when I think about the work that the Cyber Defense Assistance Collaborative has done, that many technology companies have contributed, whether it be technology or resources of people and time, is that a lot of this has been happening like bang on the fly as we figured it out, and as the next contributor jumped in, as the next company said, okay, we're willing to contribute firewall technology, or willing to contribute a threat intelligence platform. And now, okay, how do we figure out how to put this to work? How do we get it in the hands of the operators? How do we get it to the next agency over here? And that's all happening effectively in real time as more contributors join in, as another agency demands or is interested in the capability. And I think that one of the unique opportunities to learn from this scenario, if you were to look into a next conflict or an alternative scenario in the future, is that how do you have some sort of readiness exercises that incorporate maybe the collective set of those that are represented here? There's the public sector, there's university academia, there's private sector delivering technologies. And how, is there any opportunity to participate together in some sort of readiness and preparation, inclusive of tools and technology training, so that when the time comes, hopefully it doesn't, but if the time comes, that's less of a, like, how do we figure this out as things are happening? And you get a little bit further ahead in terms of the people, process, technology side. I didn't answer about the threat side, but from that standpoint, I think that's a really interesting opportunity out of this work that we've done together in many ways. I don't know if you want to speak to that at all, or if it makes any sense.
No, it does. I agree wholeheartedly. We're talking, though, I'm reminiscing in my head on some of our lessons learned during the process. And, this was a typical project, we thought, that was coming down. Hey, develop some hands-on training and some testing or some challenges so that the Ukrainians can go through this and see how they're doing. But the themes of where our training was supposed to go was dictated by the Ukrainian government. And I remember thinking at the time, like, 3 of the 4 I think is pretty good, but that one we shouldn't be focusing on that. But I didn't feel it was our right to push back and say, no, I don't think you need to do that. But as the war came about, we said, internally, like, yes, we should have been focusing more on these areas that potentially, I don't know, I'm hypothesizing here, but somebody within the Ukrainian government did not necessarily think was very important to this issue. And so my takeaway is that if we do something like this again, is as the deliverer of the content, is that we probably should have pushed back and at least had a much more deeper conversation on. I don't mean to say that I know about your country than you do, because I certainly don't. But when it comes to these areas, and so that is one of those things that we talked last night, that doing something in Ukraine or any other nation is not just as simple as, well, we have the expertise on the side of it, translate. That's not the answer. There are a lot of places that have tried to deal with these types of things like that. But, I am very happy that we had done the curriculum development projects first, because we started to understand that we are from different cultural takes and different cultural focuses. I mean, one example is that, when you're dealing with Ukrainian university faculty, they had all been educated in the Soviet system. So the whole idea of how we are going to teach was completely foreign. And it's always nice to see when you're surprised by your research or your projects, but that one for me came completely out of left field. I thought, okay, great, we got good content, everything else. But at the end of that project, when more than one faculty has said, yes, this is great information, I'm very excited to start teaching it in my university, but the process that you showed us how to teach this information, continually seeking feedback from the students to make sure that they're not left behind, is something that we had never experienced before. And that's when I got educated that, boy, the whole entire educational culture is very, very different. And we were able to take some of those lessons we learned early that helped us shape the critical infrastructure training that we did. So I'm extremely happy that we kind of learned early in the process, so that when it came time that something was actually life and death, that we were able to actually hopefully provide something that was a little bit more value on target and on point, that the operators in Ukraine were able to use that information.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point of view, and I totally agree with you that it's a huge problem in the core of educational system, and it's totally different from the West style. And what I think that's and this field, it's a huge field for the public-private cooperation, because you're totally right. And you ask government 5-10 years ago, even 3 years ago, what will be crucial for the cybersecurity? Unfortunately, it's wasn't the best fields that they are focusing on it. So here is very, very these programs with the real needs and the real challenges which we are facing in the country.
And forgive me, but I wanted to point out is that it was the process of training the critical infrastructure protection employees in Ukraine. We came out that we had done very similar training with people in the United States and across Western Europe as well. And we found that the Ukrainians in certain areas were head and shoulders above everybody else. I mean, unbelievable cybersecurity talent in Ukraine. Unbelievable. We take no credit for that. They had that coming into this. But as expected, we did find areas that, okay, we can help here. So it was a great process. And while I was, sharing that we learned some things in Go Western education system, I felt it was very important to point out that they were extremely capable students, and again, head and shoulders above many of the from other countries that we had trained.
Yeah, we have an interesting discussion yesterday here that a lot of experts in the cybersecurity in IT, they have a huge experience, but they are not fit to the traditional education system. And for now, this is a huge gap between experts with a real experience and students who are learning from the mostly theoretically point of view. And if we can to combine this, it will bring a lot of value.
So open it up to, if you have any questions, please go up to them. And thanks, Maggie. Could you go to a microphone?
Sorry, Chris, did you have something?
I was, while you go to the microphone, I'll just say that I just wanted to double down on the concept of having an established set of relationships or a relationship in place to make, if we think about the public-private partnership, defending critical, or just generally sort of around conflict. For us as an intelligence provider, things really started to take off in our contributions, we feel like, when we established someone actually based in Kiev to act as a liaison to the organizations with which we were working. We believe we were working very hard before that to help. It completely changed the dynamic once we had a dedicated liaison in place with the language skills, with the connections and the relationships to actually help provide a two-way multilateral dialogue with the interested parties there about what their requirements were, about what they were seeing in the right vocabulary, in the right language. Before that, it was a lot of we're trying our best. And after that, it became a much more productive partnership. And I think that as part of any strategy as it relates to defending critical infrastructure in places that involve, companies like ours or partners in academia or in the public sector, the existence and the presence of a liaison and someone who owns those relationships and can direct those relationships is of enormous and indescribable value in making these kinds of partnerships work.
So great point. And just for those who are tuning in from Moscow, I just want to clarify, Chris is talking about cyber threat intelligence, and that the CDAC companies are all, one of the, it's a voluntary organization, but they're all very much of the defensive only support.
Maggie McDonough from Purdue University, and also formerly of CRDF Global, although I swear I'm not planned. This question isn't planned. It's mostly for Kirill, although I'd be interested in hearing everybody's thoughts on it. As the foreign assistance money start to flow into Ukraine to support stabilization and reconstruction, what are your big priorities, in terms of dispersing that? What types of programs are your top priorities? And do they align with government of Ukraine?
You mean us as a telco companies?
Yes.
For sure, we as a telco focusing on the bridge the gap in infrastructure, because a lot of infrastructure, especially on the east of Ukraine, are destroyed. And for sure, when the and reconstruction and the investment in new facilities or factories or whatever in new businesses will be established, we will need to deliver a stable infrastructure for it, because as the modern and digital economy will depend on the connectivity. So for us, the main priority will be stability and constructions on the east of Ukraine. And for sure, maybe it's to modernize infrastructure on the west of Ukraine, because on the telcos we have a lot of legacy services around to change it. And so
thank you for a wonderful presentation. The question is, as you look at,
Can you introduce yourself?
Brian Hurd, work at Aon, or many of you know Strauss Greenberg was bought by Aon. I joined after that. Been in the community about 30 years. I was Microsoft chief of cyber crime stuff. So I also have lost a lot of good jobs over the years. In rebuilding, one of the things that happened after World War II, when Japan and Germany rebuilt their steel and iron industries, they rebuilt so well, ours deprecated. As you look at recovering, hopefully when this event ends, and I pray it ends soon, are you looking at more things like servers more often than you would if you weren't recovering post-combat? for hardened data centers or other things, how does that change the way cybersecurity architect defending or rebuilding a telco?
Interesting question, because when you rebuild it from after such crisis, you can bring the best of breed on the market. So you don't need to cover the gap with all these legacy services, with all this legacy stuff. You just can deliver the best with what you have in the market, and for sure you can focusing on the cybersecurity, on the access, on the cybersecurity for whole country. Because one of the huge problem, for example, now in Ukraine, that's B2C customers use it by Russian to attack infrastructure inside the country. And to manage this, when you face it with the huge numbers of insiders attacks in your own network or network of our peers in the market, it's a problem to cut them, because only one B2C customer is not a problem, but when it's thousands or millions, and if you cut all them, so you cut all network, and it's a huge problem. So you need to go to distributed services, security services for the end customers, and if you won't focus on it, you won't be success.
Great question, and it's one that we've raised in a number of venues where we've had an opportunity to, where think tanks are talking about the reconstruction, European and U.S. Entities talking about eventually building back better in Ukraine, and they often break it down into different sectors: energy, telecoms. Rather than a separate cybersecurity, it really should be a part of the resources in every single one of the stories, and not only for the sake of good management, but also from the standpoint that a lot of the lending that's going on, a lot of the private capital that will be going into something major like this is going to want some guarantees that whatever they're investing in won't be subject to attack and destabilization by what will probably continue to be an unhappy neighbor. So, great. Are we on time?
Go ahead, please. I have a question. Probably paper up something. We talked about the defense infrastructure that you to put up from the government side, and Kirill and I and our friends here, we had talked about how does that work with the private infrastructure, right? That's where the project Indigo that CFF and CRDF and CDAC is working on. I think we have learned from our experiences that it takes a long time to have the public policy and the regulations, and all of that is required to make sure the public-private infrastructure works. In the US, we have probably spent decades to get there. To wherever we are, I think there is a lot of improvement required. How do you see, in the time of war, that public-private partnership working together? I mean, I don't. Again, from experience, we don't see that infrastructure or the regulations there, right? But still, they have the government and then the private sector side. I would like to hear some of your thoughts on how can we accelerate that, because there is both sides of it, right? And it's a very sensitive place to share information, right?
I'd be interested in the competitive.
Yeah, it's I'll start by saying I don't think I have the answer for you or any of you here, but I will offer our experience throughout this, which has been pretty unique in seeing from the private sector side, the parties that ended up sitting in the same room, working together with one another, including very specifically, say, in our company's office, hosting, who, if you looked on paper, appear to be a bunch of private industry competitors, all sitting together, figuring out how we can actually combine capabilities to provide.
Or acquisition targets.
Maybe, but it's someone else's conversation. But it's been a really interesting experience. And one of the reflections that we had in preparation and over the months leading up to this has been in the context of this particular conflict. There has been, in my opinion, I'll say, a unique ideological alignment from the Western private industry generally, in that it allowed us to come together, participate together very easily in that sense. We continue to think through ways to provide, in our case, intelligence and security capacity that is consistent across the industry members, the government agencies in Ukraine, so that they can have some sort of level playing field and access to similar sets of intelligence, which when you think about data normalization across agencies and governments that are not in a conflict is hard enough. And when you're trying to move quickly in a conflict zone, it becomes, I imagine, infinitely more difficult. And so I don't mean to be a bit sort of meandering in the answer, but in this particular conflict, it's presented this unifying experience, I suppose. And it'll be, for those of you that are thinking about sort of future states, I think it will be a very interesting experience if there happens to be some sort of dissonance or disagreement in the alignment ideologically around different participants, whereas largely with the contributions, the aid that's been delivered has been coming from like effectively a common base of support in many cases from Western private industry, I suppose.
Just to add to that, for perspective, when Eisenhower, talked about the military-industrial complex, he was talking about the Boeings and the Lockheeds and the big arms manufacturers, which has been the dominant element of security assistance, foreign military sales, foreign military financing, various programs. Over time, security assistance definition is broadened to counter narcotics, law enforcement, counter proliferation, which CRDF Global has been involved in, and counterterrorism. But still, in every one of those, there was a mostly government or government contractor type support element. When I was at the State Department, and one of my jobs was diplomatic securities, anti-terrorism assistance. When we went over to a foreign country to provide crisis response team training and counterterrorism investigations, we used people from the contractor community. Sometimes they had law enforcement background or specialized backgrounds, but there was a community there of people who mainly provided services for governments. Contrast that with cybersecurity. When you think about cyber defense as a form of security assistance that nations provide to other nations, who do you go to? I mean, in the US, sure, we have some really whiz-bang cyber experts at the National Security Agency. They're not allowed to go talk to foreigners. I mean, we've got people in, highly classified areas, but if you want to go to someone that has expertise at or near that level, who have none of those restrictions and can work directly with foreign counterparts, it's the private sector. But I think this is where one of the things that has been, so why do we need you? Why does CDAC, CRDF, why do you need somebody in the middle of it? This is where, I think having an honest broker that doesn't have stock in any of these companies that can help facilitate the interaction to figure out what is it that's being asked for. And not just like, hey, we've got a tool here, we're trying to flack it, let's give it to Telcom. Well, Telcom might not really need that. It might need something else. And I think that's kind of what we're trying to communicate to people in the Defense Department and the State Department who are mainly the agencies, departments within the U.S. government that are most interested in kind of developing this and executing the part of the national cybersecurity strategy that involves foreign partnerships, is to say, I don't know, there are a lot of different ways you can do this, but it's probably not going to be just like what you would do with Lockheed Martin, selling an F-15. It's got to be something that's more of a public-private partnership that you can tap into this resource and orient it toward best results.
Thanks. Bill Dunyan, security consultant. There was a lot of talk about infrastructure and defensive security, and those issues are mind-boggling in their size and scope. One question I've got is around information security. My assumption is that after an event like this, all of the information in your systems and your customer databases and all the rest of it would have been compromised or copied or exfiltrated. So in rebuilding all of that, I'd be curious to understand if you've been thinking about that, how you'd go about it. I assume it's more than just asking your customers to change their password.
I assume that's aimed at you.
Okay. For the incident with data leakage, I think you mean about such incidents. It's very complex work, not only with changing passwords, because, for example, from our experience in the last year, we have a lot of compromised not customers, users, who was forced to move to provide their credentials. So it's not only about changing password; it's about to understand who is working on the other side of computer or PC. So this is a little bit more and deeper situations and to understand to change a password.
I would think that just as it mentioned in one of your earlier, that as horrible as this situation is, it unfortunately does provide you the opportunity to not build to legacy, to do state-of-the-art emerging technology that come out. So I would hope that that would apply to this as well, as you're not using the same simple, databases to hold, because we're tied to that, because that's what we all started using in the 80s and 90s. So I think I hope that this is all part of the process that brings you guys up. So I just to make one more comment here is that, the world is continuing to get stranger and stranger, at least from my perspective. And maybe it's because I sit in academia that this is quite an interesting thought exercise, is that we saw what has happened in Ukraine. We saw Russia signaling what they could do when they meddled in Georgia, and then when they invaded Crimea, and then much larger case this way. Russia is not the only aggressive nation out there. I won't define who those others are, but we all should be taking great note of kind of the playbook and the defensive playbook, on the offensive and defensive playbook on this, because we're only going to see more of it, whether it's in our countries or partnership countries or any or the rest of them. And unfortunately, nearly all countries, US, Canada included, I believe, woefully behind in our defenses of critical infrastructure. So it's going to be interesting times ahead, unfortunately, I think.
And let's dwell on that a little bit. Any final words? Good deal. So thank you. This is a very, very, word heavy topic, if you will. And the request to the community of leaders here is to make sure that the takeaway should be actionable and things that we can do. There's a lot of help required for the CRDF-CDAC mission to be, advancing this. Just what you have seen is just a tip of the iceberg. And that's what we have put together here in the project Indigo, and the work that we are doing with CRDF-CDAC and with Kirill on the private sector in Ukraine, securing, the critical infrastructure and the humanitarian mission there. So thank you, and please thank the panelists for this. Thank you. Well, we are catching up with time, and I'll promise that we'll get on time through this journey. The next panel is reflective of the work that we do. It's also reflective of the commitment that these leaders, with their exceptionally busy schedule, are able to contribute to the active projects. So I would request before we start the panel, just bring up the resource that we are putting together, and this is towards the cyber board book. For the cyber board book project started with a idea and discussion that we had, and NASDAQ invited us to come discuss the main topic and kick off this. How do we address and make the emerging CISOs and cyber leaders come up with a toolkit that they could use on a regular basis? There are many of these resources available online and also as books. There are two that I would mention. NACD has a fantastic guideline. If you want to read that, that's probably the main source to go to. So we came up with Cyber Board Book with the mission of democratizing cybersecurity and board engagement. In this particular resource, now we had about 30 or so leaders contribute for about as many sessions, and we went through the sessions every Tuesday evening, regardless of where you are. And then again, I think afternoons people will come up and discuss. And rather than putting it in actually a physical book or a binder, we just make everything available online. If you want to go to this and go to about the book, and in that you will find the different chapters. The first phase, this is first phase. We just concluded that in terms of chapter by chapter resources. Dave Revolt from Night Dragon was very generous to write a forward for us and also champion this. They're going to do an event, I think, late this month or early next month to promote this. If you click on one of the chapters, chapter 1, probably just that will show you, click on the image. So this has the meetings that we had. It's not like, we were huddled in a closed room and you'll never know what happened there. So this is the discussions that we have typically between us, and we memorialize those discussions through these chapters. There is a link to the contributors. If you have any specific question about someone's remark, you can go there and connect with them on LinkedIn. Absolutely encourage that. And then if you go to the bottom of the screen, there is a forum there. So if you have any questions, and if you have someone who has any questions to direct them to, you can go and put your remarks there. So we just finished publishing this and getting this online as of last Friday. And this is the first product of the work that this great team has done. And we really want you to take full advantage of this. So the mission doesn't end here. This is just the phase 1. So phase 2 is about getting to the next level of details. And as much as I would like to continue, pointing here, let me just invite some of the folks who have worked in this space and actually contributed to this, and also who are going to join us in the next phase. So let me invite Daniel Karimi, Avani Desai, and Mark Orsi to come up to the stage. We'll let each of these very seasoned executives, introduce themselves, give a little bit of background from the diverse way they're looking at it, and then we'll see how we shape the course of the next phase. And I'm hoping that you'll find it very helpful. Okay. Well, this one I get to sit in. So thank you for entertaining me and answering the call always. Let me start with, maybe just a quick round of introduction and background, Daniel, and then Avani and Mark.
Very good afternoon. Daniel Karimi, what a pleasure to be here. And I think when Val said, thank you for answering the calls, is because I always say when Val calls, I just say when and where. But I've been working together with, I think, for the past 6-7 years. My career started with kind of tried to be in the right place at the right time. So joined the United Nations Terrorism Prevention Branch after 9/11, joined the World Economic Forum as the markets were crashing in 2008. And as the COVID was hitting, started something called Edgelens Institute, which was devoted to issues of urban digital security. But I always was very, very excited about the promise of tech. I grew up in Turkmenistan in the middle of nowhere. I would not be here today if it wouldn't be for the promise of tech. But also very early on recognized the potential risks of it. And the work that Val and Cyber Future Foundation has been doing over the course of the years really aligned well with my personal interests. And I learned from him as much as I tried to contribute.
Thanks, Val, for inviting me. It's great to be here. My name's Avni Desai. I am CEO of Shellman. We are one of the largest niche cybersecurity assessment firms. This topic, we're new to the CFF, but this topic is really important to us as we work with 1,500 CISOs from the Fortune 5 all the way down to startups about how do they build trust with their customer base. And with new rules like the SEC disclosure rule that's out in the act, and with AI and the NIST framework and so forth, what we want to do is we want to be able to empower the CISOs all the way to the board level. So thanks for inviting me and being able to provide some thoughts on it. And thanks for all you do for the profession.
Need to hit the switch. I'm Mark Orsi. I'm CEO of Global Resilience Federation. We manage and support 17 different collective defense communities. We spun out of FSISAC, the Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center, to help other sectors stand up similar type organizations, to help companies join together in collective defense against the changing threat environment.
Excellent. Thank you for those introductions. And if the microphone is off and you didn't hear Avani's introduction, you should just go and see her executive we did. She has a very extensive background and how Shellman and her are taking the lead on this niche market. And there's so much more to be done. So coming back to this topic, governance is not new. Neither are the boards. Cyber is a new topic to this, but defense, risk management, security are not in general, right? So I wanted to probably start with you, Mark, because you have taken it from the finance industry to FSISAC and some sharing, and then to the GRF, really, about the mission of democratizing this to a very extensive community.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think about a pyramid of information sharing. So whenever we talk about information sharing, there's sort of the red flags that go up. But what are you sharing? Are you sharing, confidential information, private information? No, we're sharing those things will help organizations become more secure and more resilient. And I think this is just another aspect of it. So I think of a pyramid of information sharing, where at the bottom you have these indicators of compromise, these things that are automatically shared, and your tools can automatically take action on them. The legacy of the information sharing and analysis centers is really the middle layer of that pyramid, where you see the daily threats coming in and you need to make changes. And your cyber threat operations team are working on those on a daily basis. And at the top of the pyramid, you have those best practices and the things that you need to do to become more strategic things you need to do to become more secure and more resilient. And the board needs to be engaged in that. And we need to be able to train cyber professionals to be able to engage the board. And we need the board to also be cyber aware. And I think this is really important work that'll help progress that.
Absolutely. And I think, next step would be knowing that the board wants to know this in a certain way. Shellman's in this front end of knowing, right? Understanding what the organization is. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you uncover from these engagements that you go and do assessments and really help them with their strategy?
Yeah, sure. So, we all probably remember when Sarbanes-Oxley came out, and in Sarbanes-Oxley, they said, well, there has to be somebody on the board who has financial experience. I think a year after that, because I've been in cybersecurity for a long time, I was like, well, when are they going to say there needs to be a security or cybersecurity expert? Because we would see that there is a financial statement impact when there is a cybersecurity issue. So we've been, preaching that for a really long time, as I'm sure everyone else in this room has. But what we're starting to see is, finally CISOs are getting a seat at the table. But what the issue is they have the accountability, but they don't always have the ability of making change to that. So they're told like there's going to be this level of accountability, but we're not going to give you the budget that you need, right? We're going to give it to product instead, or we're not going to give you a seat at the executive leadership team. And that's what we're starting to see is we need that culture shift, because without that culture shift, your hands are tied, but you have all that accountability. I mean, we've seen what's happened in the industry with, CISOs having a significant impact on that. CISOs should have D&O insurance. I mean, there's a lot of things that need to happen to get to that level of maturity. We're starting to see that. I think the SEC Cybersecurity Disclosure Act in the US is talking about that a little bit more, saying that you do have to have cybersecurity leadership, mostly at the CISO area, but it still doesn't give you all of the information that I would hope CISOs would get. We're still continuing to see that. I think that's a fight that we need to continue to have, because until we get to that culture shift of where there's both accountability, where there's budget, where you can actually make change, we're not going to see much change in the profession or even the industry.
So I think that drives home the point that how much of work needs to be done between the two, right? It's CISOs gaining more authority in the same space. They are being asked to do more than they can. So thank you for shedding light on that, Avani. Daniel, you have worked across public sector now in the United Nations, then World Economic Forum, and now on your nonprofit side. What can we learn from those experiences of governance and oversight that can come down to the organizations?
So I think they say there are 3 stages of scientific idea. First, it's absolutely crazy. Second, no, there's something about it, and then we knew it all along. And I think in terms of the governance of cyber risk at the board level, we are somewhere approaching the 3rd stage. I think there's a normalization of cyber risk on the board, because as Val has mentioned, I still sit on a couple of oversight committees, and my personal experience has been, okay, this is a completely new topic. We understand nothing. Who can explain it to us? Then there was kind of, okay, it's not new. We know it's a huge risk. What do we do without it? Should we just wait for regulation? Should we buy our way out of it through insurance? Should we? Now there is really understanding that actually the buck will stop here. And it's normalized. A lot of directors are trying to educate themselves. They're trying to talk. Where I see still a lot of gaps is one thing that just to pick up what Yuval said in the last sentence, I wouldn't confuse between authority and responsibility. I think the CISOs have a lot of responsibility, but authority-wise, I still don't know. And then on the oversight side, I think there's a lot of still confusion, because the understanding is there. You did your executive course on cyber, you think you're prepared, and then you listen through those reports and you say, okay, there's a chief data protection officer, there's a CISO, there's a CTO, CIO, chief trust officer. So you yourself become so confused, and then you just bang your shoe on the table trying to understand, from the management what's going on. And I think it's probably a good kind of healthy tension right now happening, because it will lead to the maturity of the boards in terms of their engagement with the good governance processes.
Okay. Avani, your take on that?
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, if anything, this is forcing the board to start playing in this space. Before I would sit in at board meetings, and whenever I would talk about the cybersecurity risk, they're like, well, insurance will take care of it. Let's check the box. Let's get our SOC report and our PCI ROC said, okay. Well, it doesn't. All of that's like a point in time, right? And finally, we're starting to hear the board saying, well, let's see what the enterprise risk is. How are we mitigating the risk? Cyber liability insurance still comes up, but it's not okay, that's going to take the risk of everything. So, but we're still not there. I mean, the board still has a lot learning to do. And I think it's going to take a decade for them to get there, unless, we can speed that up a bit.
Sure. Yeah, just to add to that. So I worked at Goldman Sachs for about 8 years. And during my journey there, we first saw cybersecurity mentioned in the annual report. And then ultimately, our CISO became the chief risk officer. So, it was, somebody mentioned earlier that every company is a tech company. And that's true, right? And we always thought of that when we were at Goldman Sachs as well. And I've seen a lot of this where financial services maybe sort of leads the effort, or maybe the regulatory pressure helps them lead the effort to get to that place where cybersecurity becomes a focal point. And I think we're seeing that. I worked in a manufacturing organization for a year, trying to stand up a cybersecurity program after a breach. And so the board was very engaged and very interested in putting this program together. But because it's such an industry that's low in the cyber maturity, they really lost focus after a year. So it's something where we need to continually put this pressure on in different ways to get us there. So I think some of this, the SEC, all the other things that are happening are helping to put that pressure on that's required, I think, for us to get to that place where this becomes a real focus.
Absolutely, and I think there has to be someone who's reminding them all the time. And it's, our friend Jim Routh in this cohort of CISOs, he reminded us, like, Val, there's someone called a designated board geek. Nobody's named, but designated board geek who actually answers to cyber and tech and all that stuff. That reminds them, okay, you didn't come to this topic, and I think that it should become a normal topic of discussion, just like we do anything else. Well, that brings us to probably another dimension of this is how much do you think, and we had so much debate in the first phase when we recorded this, is about the cyber expertise in the board and how is that going to help? Should there be or not be an expert, or should it be a general responsibility for the entire board? How do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think there should be, it doesn't have to be a CISO on the board, right? But it has to be somebody that understands and can understand the risks that come from cyber risks, and to be able to translate that to the rest of the board. I think it's important to have, one or two people on the board that have that capability, that could be part of a cyber committee that could meet more regularly than the board meets, perhaps, or that get information more regularly than the board gets, in order to really ramp things up and really help educate the rest of the board as well.
Sure. And Avani, how do you think that, from your read of the hundreds of CISOs you deal with, how do they see their presence or lack of presence in the board?
So most of the CISOs that I have conversations with, they're typically not on the board. They do get special topics on the board. They're asked to come in and talk about the threat landscape. They're asked to talk about if there was any breaches and so forth. But what I've realized is the most mature boards are ones that have more than one cybersecurity specialist. When you have one of anything on a board, it means you should have zero, because that person is not going to be able to have the gravitas that you would hope that they would have. We work with a lot of tech companies, and they do, I think, just naturally have more security expertise. But those that have two or three cybersecurity expertise, this is front and center of their conversations. They do have a standing security, I guess, agenda item. They also will get together, if they need to talk about a security risk that came up. 6 of the boards just last week asked us to come talk to them on a special topic. This was off board about the SEC disclosure. So we're starting to see that, but those are really tech heavy companies that are doing that. I haven't seen it much in healthcare, for instance. I am seeing it in financial services, but like higher ed, never seeing it, in higher ed, even though that, it usually is a topic of conversation. But yeah.
And Daniel, what's your experience when you look at the presence?
So nobody on this panel yet brought up any sports analogies, so I will be the first one. I always think about a good board is like a good sports team, right? Pick your sport. So you're absolutely correct to point out. It's like if you have one of everything, it's not a good team, right? You don't have one forward, you have a couple of forwards, you have people playing different positions. But at the same time, I do think it's unrealistic to have all board members expected to know everything all the time. That's just not going to happen. And also, I think the way just the natural human dynamic will play out is that with the amount of information you as a good board member need to digest ahead of the meeting, it's just unrealistic, to digest that information, to think about the questions to ask. And if you sit on a couple of boards, well, my God, let's forget about it. So you just basically take what you learned on one and bring it to another. And then there is constant change and evolution, right? I mean, just to keep up with our own certifications and standards and what's happening, and then just multiply it by the accounting standards, by you name it. So the board needs to be on the top of all of that. So I do think it would be good practice, depending on the size, to have at least 2 And normally that's what ends up happening per area, where people kind of, okay, you will be the lead, I will be the vice chair on this particular issue. And that tends to happen, tends to work
network of different types being interconnected. Protocols are working with each other. If there are no protocols which don't have encryption, right? All these things continuously changing. It's sliding being more really target for us, and that's one of the biggest problems in the environment.
So we need to take the feed.
Just to add on to that, what
We'll just combine the
folks
two.
may or may not
Get the video
realize
from this
is
and
when you
audio
think about
from this.
medical device
Okay.
systems, it is
So this is the audio
truly
then.
probably the only system in your healthcare entity that touches every aspect of your business. It touches your patient, your clinicians, all your care providers, your finances, your business operations. That is the only piece that really is the cyber-physical system between your customer and the rest of the ecosystem of your employees and technology.
Yeah, those are all good points. You know, one of the points I like to make is we talk about medical devices as if there were chairs in a room and they do the same thing. You know, but there's hundreds of functions. Indeed, the FDA has about 550 device categories, device codes for software-enabled medical devices. So that tells you
power
the
source
span
back.
of
It's
control
good.
that
It's
they're
flashing
right?
green.
And they're not all the same. You can have a CT that supports a rural or a suburban diagnostic center, and that very same make and model of CT might support your trauma center, right? And the impact of that CT going down in the trauma center means that you're on divert, right? For that, you're missing 18% of your admits that come through your ER, right? Whereas if it goes down in the diagnostic center, you're rescheduling patients out or sending them to another location. So it's an inconvenience as opposed to, you know, interrupting a business interruption. And so those are real challenges there, right? And those are the kinds of impacts we have to think about, right? These devices have the ability to prevent, right, the delivery of care. And it's an interesting dynamic that people will always call up the patient safety thing, right? First, do no harm. That's the mantra of medicine and healthcare, right? And then they say, oh, there's a patient safety risk, but not all the risks are the same, just as they are not the same in business. And that's an important point because it's hard when, especially when you're talking or trying to quantify this with senior management, with the board, you know, to make those messages clear and carry them through, right? So we talked a little bit about the challenges of the technology, right? So how about bringing these new technologies into our environment? What are some of the new aspects that are happening there, David?
Sure. So I'm not plugging my organization. There's other technologies out there, but an example of some of the newer, more cutting edge technologies would be ones like my organization produces, where you can bring in essentially it's a data aggregator and intelligence engine. So you bring in threat sources, recall information, you connect into the other IT ecosystem with your network access controls and your other networking equipment, inventory management systems, and what have you. And then you can discover on the wire what's all the packets that are flowing across, reading them, making sure you understand what it is, where it is, what are the risks. Also, how do you minimize those risks, as well as utilization with regards to how can you better load balance your inventory, use it for procurement decisions, and whether or not you have the capacity adequate in each sections of your environment.
Right. So that's good. So asset management is key, knowing what's on the wire and what it's talking to, right? And Dimitri, we're now talking SBOMs, right? And the next level of asset management. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit about that.
Yes, of course. So if we think about these devices, servers, endpoints on the network, they're really blind spots for us, right? We don't know what's inside them. We know when they were built, who built them, right? And knowing that any software which is commercial or firmware of a device built from about 75 to 80% of open source code adds to the equation, right? That's a huge problem. And this is where we're seeing a lot of change now fueled by the policymakers. I mean, it's to that level that FDA mandating any company that builds devices, softwares, right, or any other systems for medical use, running software, even if it's in programmable logic controller, to maintain SBOM, software bill of materials file, right? So this SBOM, if you think about it, it's a very simple concept. I mean, we're going to a grocery store, we're buying a pack of pasta, right? I mean, it says wheat, salt, sugar, right? It's the same thing. What is the components that we have used to build our product, our software? And that's what it's about. Now, once you gain this transparency into the systems and devices, which only was available before to the MDMs, to the medical device manufacturers who actually build that, right? Beforehand, they were just keeping this information to themselves. And then when there is a risk or vulnerability, they were notifying everyone, we have it, we don't have it. But now they're telling us what are the ingredients that they use to build that thing, right? Now, once I get this information as HDO, healthcare delivery organization, I actually can take my fate to my own hands. I can monitor these components, these ingredients, and if there is any risk, right? Because we know vulnerability has been discovered on a daily basis. And if there is anything new that brings risk to my system, or I consider it as a risk, I'm now aware of it. And when I'm aware of something, I also can mitigate, I can apply mitigating controls to reduce the risk. And that's very powerful. Now, together with SBOM, I want to mention also two additional things that coming with it, right? Because we also have the HBOM, the hardware bill of materials, which also may have different vulnerabilities. And if we are talking about medical systems, it's very important to keep everything private, right? So there is also the CBOM, the cryptography bill of materials, right? What kind of ciphers, what kind of certificates we are using. And I think we will talk about that, I hope.
Sure. David?
I was just going to add to that in terms of forward-looking. I'm in full agreement. We need to have this level of information. And ideally, in order to make this scalable, where we need to go is to have devices to be able to communicate this information on the wire so that we can deploy algorithms, we can deploy automations, and have technology work for us. The current state of how things are is this is all on paper. And generally having it on paper it's burdensome, because trying to then at scale look through all of this information, you need to have some way to make sense of it and make it usable for the HDOs to properly capitalize on that level of detail.
So let's talk about, somebody mentioned earlier about people, process, and technologies, right? And technologies are great enablers. Indeed, in healthcare, right? It used to be an ICU nurse took care of 2 beds, right? And now with the advances in medical device technologies, right? Wonderful stuff. It's 1 nurse takes care of 5 or 6 patients, right? And when we see a crippling of those monitoring solutions, right? We impact patient care in a big way, right? There was that event in Germany, in Dusseldorf, right? Where there was a woman having a cardiac event, right? They were transporting her to the University of Dusseldorf. They had to divert the ambulance 20 miles, not even that far, right? And the patient passed away. The hackers, right? The folks that ransomed the hospital had no idea that they were impacting patient care. In fact, when they found out, they handed over the key immediately, right? And so that they could decrypt that, but they still impacted patient care. In 2019, we had an event in Alabama, right? Where a woman checked into a hospital, right? They had been under a ransom attack for 8 days, right? And during that, they didn't have the ability to monitor in the labor and delivery suites the status of the fetus, right? This baby went into fetal distress, had an umbilical cord wrap around. They didn't recognize that right away, right? They went into emergency C-section. The baby was born alive, and 9 months later passed away. We're still waiting for the courts to determine whether this was the first cyber event that caused a patient death, right? So it's a long, complicated thing. And in healthcare, that's kind of the impact is always a life-threatening or a possible life-threatening situation. So let's talk about, we've got some technologies here. We've got monitoring technologies. We've got the ability to detect to the next layer down, right? But how are we going to utilize that information? What processes, how do we have to rethink about our people and our resources, you know, to make that effective without overwhelming them, without flooding them with so much information, they just shut down.
And I think this is where the discussion of artificial intelligence and making things with machine learning and trying to employ automations to work for the people. But we also, on that, need to make sure we have the people. People are the most important piece to this ecosystem because technologies are a tool. People are the intelligence. And they're the ones who are actually taking the actions. They're the ones who are going to be touching the devices, making and patching them. And they know their systems better than any machine is going to. All these other algorithms, they're based on data. Who has the best understanding of that data that's going to get fed into these other systems? And we deal with this now in my organization. You have the end user or the teams that manage these devices are the ones who ultimately have the best knowledge on that data. So we need to get to a point where we are able to have not only the technologies catch up to our needs, but the processes and tracking mechanisms from a human process standpoint catching up as well.
Great, thank you. Dimitri?
Yeah, great thing. And I'm a strong believer of automation because eventually the people will be outnumbered. It doesn't matter how good they're going to be, how many people we have. We just cannot scale that factor. And I do agree with that in the way how we doing assessment and we discovering assets in our environments or our networks. We also need to be able to discover the processes. We need to be able to visualize them. We need to be able to investigate these processes to find the bottleneck, to find the mistakes, the errors. And that's really where machine learning, and I don't like the AI word, less for that, but the machine learning, right? That's where it's going to help us to discover these processes, map them, but also make sure that these processes are repeatable, right? Because we're all humans, we make mistakes. It doesn't matter how good we are. At some point, we make a mistake, we're under pressure, we're under stress, we're functioning, and that's where we need machine learning, right? To tell us, hey, last time you did something like that, your decision was different than what you're doing now. And of course, if you are doing the right decision, getting this feedback, the machine learning need to learn from us, but keep us safe. And Phil, I actually went to dig the numbers about the attack, and I discovered something very interesting that I want to share. So there was a survey by Fonneman Institute, right? These guys are credible. It's not Markets and Markets or any other company. So 43 of responders experienced at least one ransomware attack, and this was focused on healthcare delivery organizations, right? 21% of the ransomware attack involved Internet of Medical Things device. And 54% of ransomware attack caused the inability to provide service to patients. It's scary numbers.
Those are
Like what you said, it's really scary numbers. And then 49% of this attack involved rogue software installed on the device endpoints, which is amazing, right? I mean, like they were able to install malware on devices in half of these 21% of attack. And 31% of the attacks took control of patient device. So it was connected somehow to the patient. So it's happening around us. And this is from 2022.
That's new. And who was that survey from?
It was from Fonneman Institute.
Yeah.
Great.
And connected to that, Clarity just did a global survey. I don't remember how many entities were part of it, but it was in the thousands at least. It just, some of the key stats from that back exactly what you're talking about, where 78% of healthcare organizations experienced a cyber incident within the past year. And of those 78%, over 30% of them had an incident that was a result of the medical device itself. So, I mean, we have issues today. This isn't like something in the future that is from science fiction. Medical devices are being attacked today.
So, and this is one of the interesting dilemmas, right? Being in the US, the FDA is a little reluctant to talk about the risks of medical devices, to the public, for fear of FUD, if you will, right? And so, but these studies are showing that we do have a direct impact on patient care, right? We also have done studies, Dr. Christian DeMeth out at UC San Diego, right, has shown that two things, right, from the University of Vermont impact and the University of San Francisco, or not San Francisco, but San Diego cyber events, right, that a cyber event in a healthcare has an 18-month lag, right, in patient outcomes, meaning patient outcomes are worse for a period of 18 months after that, right, while the organization recovers and responds to that, right? The other thing that happens is if hospital A gets hit with a cyber attack, the surrounding community hospitals are impacted with it just as well, right? Because they are overloaded with the patients that are no longer going to that hospital, right? And so it's got broad ranging impacts on healthcare delivery itself. And these are very scary things. We've begun to see regulatory changes. Indeed, last year, the United States government, granted the FDA statutory authority, or actually the HHS statutory authority over cyber, right? And that's the FDA works for the FDA or the HHS, right? So now the FDA has statutory authority over cyber. They're beginning to demand SDLC. They're beginning to demand response and recovery programs. They're beginning to demand SBOMs for medical device submissions, all good things, right? On an international basis, we've seen the IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulatory Foundation, right, co-chaired by Canada and the United States, right? And their purpose, 13 countries have come together trying to harmonize the regulatory environment, right, on a global basis, making it easier for manufacturers to comply with the cyber requirements, for all of its customers, not just this medical device or that medical device here or there. I was surprised when I found out that medical device manufacturers built company-specific devices, makes and models, for different countries because of the different requirements. And that's got to be a huge burden on the manufacturing community. So if you guys want to address maybe some of the regulatory changes and what you might anticipate the market response to those it will be.
So the couple of pieces that I want to add to this. So being responsible for notification of a breach within a timely manner, as well as having systems that are patchable during the entire design life cycle. Those are both key aspects. But what needs to also come into play with regards to this, as was mentioned before, regulatory is your baseline. So it's like the minimum that you need to meet. But where we need to go from here is we need to also make sure that we have communication chains that are open. We have a point of contact between our organization and every MDM or other vendor that our organization has. You need to be able to have that direct communication so that you're not getting lost in the loop of the 1-800 numbers when it comes to a cyber incident. We also have technologies that are changing, and to your point with regards to discussion around taking remote control, there's also intentional remote control that's being developed. I was part of an initiative called NetSyn that was spun out of the Army Research Labs for emergency response for COVID. And that was for going into under-resourced areas and being able to provide additional support for whether it was spinning up field hospitals or providing triaging or telemedicine or other pieces like that. Part of it was development of remote control of ventilator systems. And that is so that you can provide that remote care support. And there's all kinds of ethical and security concerns that go along with that. But we need to be thinking about how can this kind of a technology be misused. But it's essential that we keep moving forward because these have great potential impacts in terms of the quality of care that we can then bring to other places that may not have that.
Well, I think that we need more regulation in the place, and we need regulation with abilities to enforce, I would say, adherence to specific frameworks and standards in this place. And SBOM, one of them, VEX is another one. We need to adopt new standards which are machine readable, right? Which allows us to automate things and to have very fast instant response in such cases. So I believe that's kind of what can help here.
Mind if I say a counterpoint real quick?
No, please.
So I agree with you with regards to the standards piece is essential for informing the entities in terms of how to implement what are the minimum requirements. But I'm sure everybody in this room can attest to this, that you're overloaded by standards. That what we really need to have is also to have some way to synergize standards and have over-encompassing documentation and policy so that we have a central location that we can go to, because there's so many different entities that write standards. There's so many different places that potentially have regulation on different pieces of our business. So I just wanted to make that point as well.
Completely agree with you.
So one of the keys I think here is, because we have purpose-built devices, we have to talk about the collaboration, the stakeholder collaboration. One of the challenges in healthcare, right, is who owns what when it comes to a medical device, right? So we've got the clinicians that identify the need to purchase a device and they implement it, and that's what they use to do their job. And healthcare is an information system, right? It relies on information. In fact, when a patient is in a hospital, 90% of clinical decisions involve a clinical diagnostic study, right? So it's all the information that we provide in there, right? But we've got biomeds that take care of this stuff. Sometimes they're in-house biomeds, sometimes they're third party, sometimes they're the manufacturers. We've got IT that is responsible for keeping the things talking, right? Keeping the wire clear and elements like that. And so they talk about a shared responsibility, but one of the challenges is really we've got to declare who's responsible for what elements, right? If we just say it's shared, and one of the three of us got it, well, that means none of us has got it. None of us is going to do it, right? So I have to say, you're responsible for doing this, and I'm responsible for doing that, right? And so sitting down in your organization, and this doesn't matter whether it's med devices, whether it's OT, whether it's IoT, right? You've got to sit down with all of the stakeholders and say, what are the tasks that need to be done to keep this device operational, right? And cyber is really just a failure mode, right? It's a way for things not to work when they're needed and in ways that they're expected to work, right? Just as physical failures are the same thing. It's another failure mode. So think about how devices fail, right? What's the impact on that? How are you going to respond, get these devices back into service? How are you going to be able to continue to do your business, right? And who's responsible for doing what tasks on that, right? I often tell the story, for biomeds in a hospital, if a CT goes down, they know who they're ordering the tube from. They know how long it's going to take to get on their loading dock. They know how long it's going to take them to install it and calibrate it, and they can tell the radiology director when they can return that CT back to service. They know that, right? What they don't know is what happens if the hard drive crashes? What happens if the hard drive gets ransomed? Nobody has thought about those kinds of impacts, those kinds of failures, if you will. And we have to begin to expand that aperture. It means getting the folks that are responsible for keeping this stuff running, whether it's your OT team, your biomed team, your manufacturer, the vendor that's supporting this equipment.
And I would just add to that. So one piece that was very successful regarding this at Mass General Brigham is we had a laboratory. So in this laboratory, we had a full cyber range that I architected that we were able to use for emergency preparedness and response activities, use it for cyber assessments, use it for integrations. You were able to, in an environment that didn't impact patient care, you could test out workflows, test out technologies, and bring people together to work through like all of these different challenges of who needs to be at the table for what purpose and who's responsible for what, and let's do a simulation. I highly recommend, if you have the budgetary resources, to make a production equivalent environment in your organization, because it is invaluable.
Or use a cyber range. I'm not sure if there's any for medical environments, but I know that the military utilizes this capability a lot with different companies. So maybe that could be an option to train the involved people for instant response. Of course, planning your BCP, right? I mean, have tabletop exercises on this matter. And unfortunately, I mean, one of the recent attacks on Prospect Medical in US, right? In August, it was like a month ago. It took them 40 days to bring up 16 hospitals to full operation after the ransomware attack, which is, we can only imagine how they were impacted. And as you said, it's a ripple effect, right? It also impacts everyone around them, other hospitals, other medical facilities. So again, we need to plan, we need to see how we can shorten this response times, and we need to train our people.
And in terms of the training piece itself, what hasn't been discussed a lot today in terms of the workforce shortage or in terms of training aspects is we're experts in cybersecurity. We're not experts in education. We should be into our training programs, we should be bringing in experts in education that is their domain, their expertise, because they're going to have the best knowledge of how do you translate this information that we have in our heads into a actual program that will follow the milestones needed for developing that knowledge with our employees, with schools, with other potential avenues with regards to outreach. So highly emphasize, please bring in education experts and don't assume that because we went to school, therefore we know how to create these programs.
So very good. So let's help these folks out, right, for a little bit. Let's talk about what have we seen? What have we seen our customers do? How have they responded to some of the threats and the risks that are on medical device or OT systems, and what would you recommend folks to do to start, to address some of these so that they can get a leg up?
Well, it starts with your procurement practices where I would, in terms of contracting, make sure that you're incorporating into your contract clauses where you have that defined communication pathway with your vendors, as well as one of the pieces that I've did at Mass General Brigham is remove that reverse engineering clause that would prohibit us from being able to pen test the equipment that we're buying. So make sure that it meets different cyber regulations, and that's how you're going to eventually create change in your organization as you're phasing out technologies. As far as the current legacy systems that you have in place, the inventory management practices, making sure that your you know who owns what and where it is going to be the most critical piece, as well as having your as you're saying, the with regards to biomeds, having an understanding of all the different pieces of how to fix a component. You should have that same level of detail of knowledge with regards to the cybersecurity of those medical device systems.
Set up multi-factor authentication.
Very good. So, and I'm going to put in, I'm going to put in a plug for the HSCC, who has put out a model contract language for medical device security, right? And so you can go to hscc.org. They've got lots of resources, right? Not just the model contract language, third-party risk management, lots of resources specific to the healthcare sector, but it's applicable across the board, right? It's good stuff. One of the things that they do have too is also the joint security practices for hospitals. They identify for both small and medium and large hospitals, what are some of the biggest risks and what are some of the practices that you can do to mitigate those risks in there. So it's a very good topical resource. And just before we open up the mics, let's just future outlook, right? You don't want to mention AI or ML or one of those, right? We can talk about quantum computing, right? But what do we see on the horizon, right? That's going to change the game relative to medical devices. Somebody mentioned Rust earlier, so we're beginning to develop and utilize more secure software, right? So how is that going to change the environment moving forward?
So there's two pieces that I wanted to discuss. One is with regards to the patching and maintenance of medical device systems. In the IT ecosystem, we have containerization that's been part of our tool set for a long time. Containerization will allow you to take down an individual component, patch it, update it. You don't have to take it necessarily out of operation. We should be looking towards our medical systems to be able to do something like that, because the current state of patching is you have to take it out of operation and pull it and coordinate when it can be taken out of operation. If we want to have something where it's more sustainable, where we can patch on a more regular basis, where medical devices are not so far behind, we need to use technologies like containerization to enable that. The other piece I wanted to mention is a plug for the Healthcare Center of Excellence that, or actually it's going to be an overall center of excellence for all critical infrastructure sectors, but healthcare is going to be the first aspect that we want to focus on. And Clarity is working with the Cyber Future Foundation for this, and we're trying to essentially develop a environment where you can have the HDOs, you can have manufacturers, regulators, cyber researchers, the community, everybody have a safe space they can come together and work through all these challenges that we're talking about. And part of that is going to be also having a cyber range laboratory-based environment built so that we have that as a community resource. So I just want to give that as another plug. And if you're interested in participating in that and being a contributor, please reach out to myself or Catherine, and we'd be happy to have you aboard.
Oh, you covered most of it. So maybe I'll just touch on the quantum technology, quantum computing. There is a lot of attacks now that actually taking the data and waiting for the technology to evolve so they can decrypt it. We need not to forget about that. And it has to happen right now, because every day that passes, these adversaries get more and more data. Yes, they cannot access, they cannot see it right now, but 2, 3, 4 years down the road, they will be able to see this data. And this is a privacy of patients, of healthcare organizations. It could be also business information, very sensitive. It could be related to intellectual properties. It could be anything, but we need to take care of encrypting this information and data.
Very good. Val, do we have a couple minutes for questions? Oh, they heard break. There's no questions.
But yes, of course, the speakers here will be available, so grab them for the 10-15 minutes. We'll assemble back maybe right at 3:05, and you don't have to go too far. Coffee's right there, and stretch your legs.
Please thank me in joining, or please join me in thanking our panel.
So this is a very important topic for us, and the healthcare COE. Let's take a picture right here. You can stand up here if you want.
That's stuff. We've got our whole